So I thought I'd kick off first of all with this slide. I don't know if anybody saw this recent report, so this was just published in the last week or so, talking about the telemedicine market and the annual growth rate that is predicted for the next 5 or so years is almost 20%. So I imagine that most of the people in this room have been engaged with telehealth, telemedicine for at least 10 years or more, have probably been saying one of the same things that I've said over the course of a number of years, which is it's been 2 years away for the last 10 years, and it's still 2 years away. But I would think this, for me, feels like we are at that inflection point. And there is a number of things that have come together that really change it. And Kathy and I were talking just before this, talking about telehealth and where it was going. And I think she made a really pertinent point to all of this, that it's no longer tele, it's just part of the continuum of health. And I would suggest that we are at that point. And I hope you're going to see through the course of this presentation some of the reasons why that is going to be the case in your future in the delivery of healthcare, and some of the reasons why that's important. So for those of you that don't know me or can't find me, I would tell you that the internet is down. I'm reachable through any of these channels. I do respond. A lot of people track me on social media. I'm asked many times, who do I have doing my social media? You're looking at it. Everything that I do is done by myself. So one of the things that I've found is important in this whole process is being efficient with the use of time, making maximum use of time. And I enjoy it. One of the things that happens for me is that I get to engage with people that I wouldn't ordinarily have an opportunity to talk to as a result of some of the social media. So for all the negatives, it's been a really positive experience for me, and I've really enjoyed some of the engagements and interactions that I get as a result of that. And you'll hear some of that through this presentation. So what are we going to talk about this morning, now that I've got the technical problems out of the way? I'm going to talk a little bit about health declines and why healthcare is such an essential part of our lives. We're consuming this enormous amount of GDP in this country, and we're struggling with that overwhelming burden on the incomes of both individuals, of society. And there are some underlying problems that I think telehealth and telemedicine is really set up to deliver against. We'll talk about some of the innovation opportunities and the things that are going to change. You saw some of that in the halls last night, if you were lucky enough to be there. And then we'll take a little peek into the future and some of the potential changes. I hope you'll get inspired. I'm known as a proton. I always think positive and believe that there is tremendous opportunity. And whilst we have problems, I think one of the great things about healthcare and the way that we deliver it is it's personal. It doesn't matter whether you're here professionally, whether you're a clinical professional, you deliver healthcare, you're engaged in healthcare. We all consume it in some form or another. And that's important because that's the way that we're engaged in this, not only on a professional basis, but also on a personal basis. So for those of you that don't know, we have this enormous problem. And don't believe that this is just the United States of America. It is not. In fact, diabetes, which is one of the preeminent challenges that we face, is actually an exploding disease. I would tell you that the United Arab Emirates, and indeed much of the Middle East, is suffering a bigger expansion in diabetics in the younger age groups than we are seeing in this country, and we're seeing a tremendous number. That is a chronic disease. In some instances, and in many instances, it's preventable. And we're seeing 14 million new cancer cases per year. We'll come back to that figure a little bit later on in the presentation because it has some ramifications in terms of some of the technologies and the way that we deal with it. And heart disease, major killer in our society, and yet enormously preventable. So all of these lifestyle type conditions are occurring. Yet on the flip side, with our consumers, we find that our consumers are all looking at the healthcare system saying they don't see hospitals as the future, as where we're going to be delivering healthcare. I think that's a relatively interesting viewpoint for the healthcare system, particularly for those hospitals that continue to build new facilities. I think we're going to see a change in the way that they behave, and certainly from a telehealth standpoint, an interesting opportunity for that industry. 75% saying happy to video conference, and I'm sure some of you are going, really? That's not been our experience. We're still struggling to sort of expand that. But I think that inflection point is here for a number of very good reasons around finances, billing, private patients, high deductible plans, and so forth. We're seeing a willingness to share personal health data, which is an essential component of our continued progress in terms of the innovation that we expect to see in our healthcare delivery system. And then hypertension. So I'm all about incremental changes. I have my own company that focuses on these small changes that we can bring to improve both the healthcare system but also ourselves. If you look at some of my videos, I talk about some of the consumer level incremental changes that you can bring. Here's your first one. If you are not measuring your blood pressure on a regular basis at home or in some regular consistency in perhaps CVS, Walmart, where they have those stations, you're missing an opportunity. Look at that number. 1 in 3 adults are suffering from hypertension. It is a silent killer. There are no symptoms. We don't feel anything as a result of high blood pressure, except we know that we have it if we measure it. And yet we can prevent it, we can do things about it, and if you don't measure it and know that you have hypertension, you can't do anything about it. That's enormously significant from a personal health standpoint and from a chronic disease standpoint of all of the costs that are associated with this healthcare system that we're struggling with. Same is true of diabetics, and I think we're seeing that, and we're certainly seeing an increase in the incidence of low-carb diets, high-carb diets, high-fat. There's all of this variation. The one piece of advice I have for you is it's individualized. What suits one person does not necessarily suit all others, but you must measure to be able to improve. So what is life in general? Well, this is it, and I know, I get this, well, just wait, it gets better. And I've played around with that curve a lot, and I've tried to sort of move the numbers so that people, don't focus too much on that. But this is roughly a representation of life. But this is actually much more typical of people's lives. We hope we're in that top third. Sometimes we're in that pre-illness. That's the hypertensives. That's the diabetics that don't know that they're diabetic. And we're not really aware of that condition. And then this is the section down at the bottom, the illness, where we intersect with the healthcare system. Hopefully we get better, but if we don't, we end up dying. Well, what is the biggest impact that we can have to improve our health? The majority of it is lifestyle. It's not about healthcare. And if we're not measuring any of the things that contribute to that, that's a huge problem. So this is our essential challenge in the healthcare system that I'll keep coming back to. But there's another way of looking at this chart. It's one that most people resonate with. So this is the fun section, and this is the no fun section. And everything that we do in healthcare, in telehealth, telemedicine, in wellness, is about moving people from the no fun to the fun section. And that is ultimately the goal of physicians. It's the goal of healthcare professionals. It's the goal of us as individuals. And I'm going to reconcile that throughout this presentation. So it's easy to remember. We're moving from no fun to fun. So how do people decline in health and we don't notice? So I thought I'd pick a case study. This individual, young, healthy, he played sports. He was walking all the time. He had a reasonably good diet, really didn't seem to have any problems. And then suddenly, had a cardiac event. It was an emergency event. He got transferred to a hospital as an emergency. The ambulance was taking him to the cardiac center at 2 o'clock in the morning. His family were chasing him. They failed to follow the ambulance in a foreign country. They lost it, then they refound it again because they happened to see it pass by in a street up at the end of the street that they were looking at. And how is it that he declined and we didn't know that he was going to have this sudden cardiac event? Well, this individual is my dad. Some of you may have noticed that. You might see a resemblance. That's us a little bit later on. And he has 2 physicians as sons. And yet we completely missed, for 2 years, looking back, the fact that he was declining in health. He was no longer walking as far. He was starting to develop all of the symptoms that in hindsight we look back and go, whoa, how did we miss that? And yes, that was us chasing the ambulance in a foreign country with no GPS trying to find him. It all worked out in the end, but ultimately, I look back at that, and this is essentially one of the challenges that we face in healthcare, is this decline that we normalize. And you may find that in your own lives with your own relatives, your parents, friends, and so forth. What happened with him was he used to walk 2 miles, and then it became 1.5 miles, and then it was 1 mile, and then he wasn't. And for him, it was all normal, and for us, we weren't watching it closely enough. And that's where some of this data starts to play in to offer us some new insights that we can't see because we essentially normalize this data. So that's the power of all of this information. That is an essential component to the contribution of tracking this care in a way that delivers insights that can allow us to identify that, not at the urgency point when it's much harder to treat. We know that in medicine, so that we can place some intervention beforehand. So finding that high blood pressure, finding that diabetic, finding the overweight individual that needs help losing that weight. So that's what we're going to focus on as part of this, is those data opportunities, and in particular, telehealth and telemedicine. And again, I would start to move that out of the tele and say that it's part of the continuum. But what is that continuum? Well, it starts with all this home monitoring. I saw a huge swathe of opportunities for this monitoring equipment that we've now got that we can start to deliver. And if you think about this in terms of wellness, it gets increasingly important to deliver that out to the individuals so that we can track those declines and watch it over time. So it's not the individual points on those charts, it's the trends that show up. We have insights that can start to offer teledermatology, so the ability to see things change in our skin if we start to track that on a regular basis. We've got advanced monitoring equipment. I'm going to touch on some of those innovations that I think are really important that we're going to see explode in the virtual care world, in the medical home, as I see that replacement for the hospital. And then some of the robots that are providing new capabilities to our patients. We've got this mass spec pen that has instant identification of cancer cells based on visualization. You can see in the video, this is a full-on video session that takes full body imaging of individuals and then allows you to compare those individuals from the first session to the next session and watch those changes. So now it's no longer based on memory or comparing those photos by the individual. We can automate that in a system that starts to deliver that in automated intelligence so that it can track it for you and highlight those changes very quickly. That kind of technology, I think, is becoming more available. It doesn't have to be the large-scale systems that you see up in the top. But we've also got assisted interventions, and they can be simple. In the case of those individuals, and you see I'm a dog, so somebody predicted that as part of the question and answers. Walking of the dog, so one of the challenges, we know that dogs and animals and cats are very good from a health standpoint. but there's a challenge. Can we make sure that those animals are cared for? And for some of the people, that's harder to do. So we've got drones walking them. But we've also got telehealth assistants that can call in drones for cardiac events. And in the case of your phones, one of the things that we saw with Uber and some of these other devices is you've got geolocation. Well, we've now got that with GPS-based devices, so I can say I'm here, and if I'm in an urban area, the ability to get the supporting medical equipment to that place can be very difficult. A drone can fly directly. We're starting to see drone deliveries. In this case, we've got drone deliveries of cardiac support equipment, and we can provide video support to allow the individual that called it, who may not be medically trained, to deliver that life-saving shock therapy. But there's also innovation that takes drones to both deliver and collect. So in this case, out in Africa, pulling in samples that are collected from remote areas that could take sometimes days to reach, and also the delivery of blood and blood products that can be life-saving in certain instances that they only have a limited supply and don't have the ability to get it out as in the same way that we do. And we have some of that here in the US and some of the Western world where we've got very remote areas that don't have easy access for medical technology. But what about telehealth prediction? So if you look at the video up in the top, we're sensing the fact that the air quality is declining. We're alerting an asthmatic, asking him to test his respiratory function during the night, then sending that to the individual clinician who reviews the data with the patient, and they then transmit their therapy to the 3D printer that prints off the medication for that patient for that day, which is consistent with all of the surrounding information that we have about air quality and that individual patient. Down in the bottom, we extend the capabilities of this remote monitoring. So Eric Topol, a good friend of mine who many of you may know for some of his digital health and his latest book, talks about the stethoscope being replaced by the ultrasound. One of the problems with the ultrasound, and I'll tell you as a clinician, it's a real struggle for me, both to read it but also to actually carry it out. This is not a two-dimensional activity, it's a three-dimensional activity. And what you see with this innovation is a barcode that is coded in such a way to allow you to guide somebody in terms of the rotation and positioning of that particular ultrasound probe that's tied to a mobile phone, by the way, that allows you to look at and examine an individual remotely and guide them through that process. And that's actually an automated agent that's giving guidance to get the best images. We've already seen examples of that, not with the barcode, but some of the simpler versions of this being delivered in Africa to patients that need to know whether they need to go to the clinic to deliver their baby. If they have life-threatening conditions that would actually cause problems for the delivery, that might be a 3-day trek. If they don't need to go, they're going to stay at home and deliver with the midwife. What happens is they transmit the ultrasound images that are captured by a clinically trained professional. They're not typically a physician. They might be a doula or even a midwife. And then those images are read, and they come back with a message, simple text message that says, stay or go. And if it's go, they go to the clinic. And in that instance, you didn't save one life, you saved 2 lives with a simple ultrasound and a text message that said you needed to go. And if they didn't need to go, then they were safe to deliver at home, which was, of course, was much better for the patient and for their family. But now we've got all of these wearables. I used to ask the audiences, I don't bother anymore because everybody's carrying some kind of a wearable. If you're carrying a mobile phone, that's tracking your actual activity. You can see all of your steps. It's recorded. You don't actually have to wear a device. But we're seeing this explosion across the universe of technology. In this case, it's surpassing all of the other systems. In fact, the Internet of Medical Things, I think, will exceed our capacity to pull that in. And the integration of that data is going to be essential for any kind of teleservice and medical home monitoring. Just think about all of the video services that we're starting to see from a security standpoint now being offered from a medical home standpoint that says, I'm going to track mum, and the fact that mum didn't come across the living room floor between 8 and 9 like she normally does is a problem. So that we need to check in on her and see that she's okay because she's in her home and we want her to be safe and medically sound. And although she has the medical alert bracelet that she touches if she falls and can't get up, if she's like my mum, she never carried it with her, and the one time she fell, she didn't have it, so she lay on the floor. And so all of those things add up to this engagement and ability to track. Now, some of you will look at this and say, this is a little bit extreme, but I want to tell you a story about the quantification of the individual. I used to think I was quantified. That's me with Google Glass. Yes, I did buy a pair. I still have it if anybody's interested. I think there's some leftover value at least. That's the AliveCore device, so that's the EKG sensing sled. But I'm nothing to Chris Dancy. So this guy has somewhere of the order of 30 or so sensors. That's his Google Calendar that you can see on the right-hand side. And those are all the data elements that he's capturing and recording and processing. And he's now moved long past Google Calendar, and he presents this in much more interesting formats. But most people can relate to this and see, that's a lot of data. And you say, well, it's a little bit extreme. I will tell you he lost over 100 pounds by tracking his activity. And I'm going to give you one incremental step that you might take home and actually use to help you in terms of bad health habits. So those of you that have Netflix or you binge watch television, Chris discovered that he binge watched like most of us do and maybe watched the whole of the Game of Thrones season 1. Or perhaps it's season 7 leading up to season 8 that's just coming out. And what he discovered was when he watched 2 episodes in succession, he descended into poor health habits. He would go to the fridge, pick out the dips and pull out the chips and do things that were really unhealthy. Not only unhealthy just sitting and watching, let's be clear. If he changed his viewing habits and instead of watching episode 1, episode 2, he watched something else from a different video program. So maybe Game of Thrones followed by Breaking Bad. I'm giving away things that I like, obviously, but... and watched episode 1 from Game of Thrones and then episode 1 from Breaking Bad, his habits improved. He didn't descend into this poorer quality health behavior. Now, it wasn't solely attributable, but remember, he lost 100 pounds just by changing his behavior. That's enormously significant. That's insights that I think are welcome and useful. And at some point, we'll get to this. And ultimately, I really think we're almost there. We may not be displaying it, but we don't go online, we live online. And that data is actually servicing a need. And you can look at it and say it's not relevant, but I think it's part of that insight to move us from the no fun to the fun section by giving us constant data. It's frictionless kind of accessibility of information. Any of you out there have a wireless weighing scales? I used to have a set of weighing scales in the bathroom, like many of you probably did. I'd step on it, and I'd look at the number and think, oh, I must record that. And at some point, I probably had a spreadsheet, and I would try and record it. I might write it down. I'm pretty sure that my memory faded between the point that I looked at that number and when I actually wrote it down or recorded it, because I never really, I didn't do as well as I did once I put in the wireless sensor. It's frictionless. There's no requirement for me to do anything. It's a little bit disturbing to my wife because when she gets on, I get notification as well. No, I'm kidding. That's not really true. I'm not going there. But it's frictionless. So it goes in, and it's now in the cloud. I want to say I'm 30 pounds down, and it's not attributable only to the sensor, but it is attributable to the fact that I know that I get on, it's just part of the routine, and I have to accept that I have a fluctuation. I've probably got 4 to 6 pounds that I can fluctuate in a day, depending on, as much as anything, hydration and fluids and so forth. But the general trend is down, making it frictionless. So if you had one thing, it would be pick up something that you can find in your own personal health that you can track on a regular basis that will give you insights and allow you to make those small changes. Just make one step and find that success. This, so there is really essentially a continuum of these that go from these very simple tracking from weight all the way through to sleep and mood. I think sleep is the foundation of health. We're starting to see sensors. My bed tracks my sleep. It's included in the systems that I have. It's truly fascinating to see what helps. I will tell you that one bad night's sleep or lack of sleep is far worse than going out to McDonald's or not exercising in terms of the health impact that it can have on you. I think we're going to really change our view of sleep, and it's going to become an essential component of everything that we do in the healthcare system, as well as monitoring. But we get down to blood glucose, and I'm going to show you some of those sensors, and even DNA and the microbiome. That's really interesting opportunities. One of the most interesting areas that I've seen where we put sensors in, we're still driving. I think that might disappear. I know there's some views, well, you know, these self-driving cars, but ultimately we're not good drivers. I know more than 50% of people think they're above average drivers. That's clearly not possible statistically. But we're going to put sensors. So I saw this with one of the manufacturers, and they had put some stress sensors and an EKG sensor in the steering wheel, which is, by the way, going to disappear. Who's going to need one? It's just in the way at some point. More interesting one, and it's the one that sort of raises a little bit of concern in my audiences, is we can weigh people in the car. Actually, it's a fantastic place to weigh you. You always get into the car. And I know there's people go, oh my God, I don't want to be weighed in the car every day I get in. I know, but the reality is, Lord Kelvin said, if you can't measure it, you cannot improve it. And I know it can be very debilitating as you watch that. But ultimately, if you're not watching it, you just tend to ignore it. So these new sensors are going to involve the patients and start to deliver in this value in a way that I think is really interesting and exciting from a telehealth standpoint. And this is the biosensing landscape, and you can see everything up here is movement and heart rate and sleep, all the way down to individualized, and I'll pick out that little pill in the bottom right there. That is the sensor that is added to, that's about the size of an aspirin. So you swallow that, and now we know that you've taken your medication. We know that 50% of medications are not taken by patients. They're not even filled. And the idea that we're assessing the effectiveness of drug therapy based on 50% of people actually taking it seems a little bit problematic. That's been approved by the FDA. It's still a little bit expensive. It works on the potato battery. Yes, science was important at school. That was an important experiment. And you know, some of these are not proving out at this point. That's the corneal sensor that Google proposed for diabetics to sense glucose. I think they've now since abandoned that. So not everything is going to work out. But this particular study, so this is from UCSF taking the Apple Watch and the Apple Health Kit, replaces the Framingham Heart Study. For those of you not familiar with the Framingham Heart Study, that is the guidance. It is the gospel as to why we do what we do for cardiac patients and for many other clinical conditions. And that was based on a 2-yearly cycle for seeing patients, reviewing them and assessing them, sending them questionnaires. So we were only seeing them at very, very infrequent intervals. This study, and it had somewhere of the order of 40,000 patients. This study already has 1 million, and they're submitting their data on a daily basis. We are now amassing huge amounts of data very quickly. It's vastly exceeded. So I think the insights that we're going to start to record. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating everybody gets in, gets their heart monitor, and starts to create some concerns about our heart disease because suddenly our Apple Watch is saying, you've got a problem, call your cardiologist. That creates its own downstream impact. But recording this data and submitting it starts to offer us new insights. And as you saw from the video, the physician can see that information and incorporate that in. Most physicians will say, I don't care about these individual data points. And that's probably true. What they do care about is the trends. So it's never a data problem. It's always a filter problem, and we need to filter that data accordingly as part of our process. Some of these next-gen sensors are really interesting. This one in the top actually inserts a fiber that's in the body. We sense that on an ongoing basis, and it starts to offer some additional biochemical insights on an ongoing basis for a continuous period of time. That's the continuous glucose monitor and the attachment of that. Again, opportunities to see the impact of this, extraordinary in terms of the way that we see this fluctuation in people that have good insulin and glucose control. And then this last one, most interesting, most exciting from a hypertension standpoint, but still a little bit disappointing. This is the Omron watch. I don't know if you can see, but the inside of that is actually a cuff. And I thought when they announced that they had continuous blood pressure monitoring, it was really continuous, but it's not. You actually have to stop. You've got to hold it in a certain position. That's imperfect at this point. It's still offering friction. But monitoring our blood pressure on an ongoing basis is going to be essential as we start to look at this hypertensive crisis that we're seeing across the continuum of the number of people that are suffering from that, and the preventable condition that we could actually impact. What about robotics? Well, so robotics, we've seen these big Hero 6 kind of lookalikes. We see a lot of that in the Far East. I think they're far in advance of some of the areas that we've currently got in terms of robotics and automation. And I know people look at these and say, well, we want personalized healthcare, and I'm not discounting that. But the opportunity to provide that support and infrastructure where we don't have the resources to be able to do that offers us a new way to extend our capabilities at lower cost. And in fact, you can see in Japan, they're actually using robots. This is not a big robot. You can see from the context of the audience that's watching and following along. And if you haven't seen the videos of the progress of robots and their movement, and again, it feels a little bit Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of look-alike, but they're really making incredible progress in terms of the stability. What you're seeing that robot do in terms of jumping up the steps is extraordinarily hard, but we've seen that over the last 2 or 3 years, so that we've got real movement. And then up in the top, this engagement is potential for interaction, and it's interesting. People are actually more honest with robots than they are with human beings, even if they know that the robot is going to report back on them to the clinician. So we've seen good studies that say if you have a robot interaction beforehand or an AI and automated interaction, patients will be more honest, particularly with difficult topics or topics that they don't want to discuss, even knowing that that information is going to be passed off to the physician. Here are some real examples of robotic automation. This is a fully automated robot on the left-hand side. That is stitching, and it's not real skin, it's a latex lookalike, but there is no human involved. There's just cameras around the outside of that, and it's going in and stitching. That used to be the intern's job. The intern's job is disappearing. And the one on the right-hand side is an assistive robot. So actually standing in, and what's interesting about robots is they have different visual acuity, and I'm not talking about just the vision capabilities, but they can see in different spectrums. So you can start to mark out parts of the field of view with UV sensors that they can see, so that they've got the capability to mark out the tumor where the surgeon might not be able to see. If you can attach markers that are UV engaged, you can see there, that might be infrared, it might be UV, but they've got different visual acuity, which offers new capabilities. Artificial intelligence applied to telehealth offers us a new way to predict the future. If you're not convinced, we see it with the weather. That's happening all the time. I used to say that was the only job that you could be wrong more than half of the time and still keep your job. I think it's still true, but they have gotten an awful lot better, although they still get things wrong, to be clear. If you're not familiar with Moneyball and the predictive capabilities in sports, huge potential. They really turned around a team. This is one from an educational standpoint where we're looking at those students that are likely to fail out before they fail out, to apply the limited resources that we've got to offer some intervention. And then a heat map from a crime standpoint. I'll talk about bias in a second. But in terms of capabilities, it's not always perfect. And I have a different slide that I use sometimes that talks about the World Cup and how wrong they got it. But I thought it was more relevant to pick this, and sorry if I offend anybody, I don't know sports teams, but there was some predictions. This is the AI prediction that talked about who was going to make it to the final of the March Madness. And you can see that Duke was the 27% on favorite for winning. That didn't happen, as I saw last night. So we don't always get it right. Sorry, no offense intended. I know we're close to wherever, so there's probably some, I'm not gloating. I don't have a team I support. I think Maryland was knocked out weeks ago, if I was supporting anybody. Little bit of point on bias. Really essential to take account of this as part of the whole process. The problem is that the data sets already have bias in them in many instances. And we create this feedback loop, and I reference back to that heat map of crime, and one of the criticisms around that is that essentially is mapping existing crime, and you're reinforcing that, which is not necessarily good. So it's an underlying current to this that we have to be cognizant of as we think about this AI. But there's real potential to use this AI as part of our telehealth engagement. So using a interactive agent that you can see in this case, which is an automated. So this isn't a real person, you can guess that, although some of the new versions of this look as real as anything. And we're watching that individual and listening to the voice. So there's AI involved in listening. And in fact, there's a real sense that we might be able to sense disease, not just depression. In this case, you've got gaze attention, voice acuity, that adds in additional insights as part of that. And again, talking to that, you can do that, and then that elevates it to raise the status so that somebody gets involved where we apply our limited resources. Quick word about virtual reality. If you didn't experience the Pokemon Go revitalization, what was really interesting about this is we saw this big bump in activity because people were actually getting out and getting involved. It was an engaging virtual augmentation of the reality. But in fact, it goes further than that. We've got medical education, the ability to look at the body in a different way. That new insight can create three-dimensional images that we can interact with that are constructed from real MRIs and CTs. We can overlay that virtual interaction in the bottom right in a surgical field in a remote location. And then for some people, their favorite, the AccuVein, which actually allows you to identify the vein accurately so that it's no more constant needle injuries as we just try and take a simple blood sample. If you are in doubt about the significance of gaming in healthcare, just look at these statistics. So if you're not familiar with World of Warcraft, you maybe not have a 20, 16-year-old something, whatever. This is a huge business worldwide. $5 million in subscriptions just on World of Warcraft. So that's not the only multiplayer game. So people are paying money for something that they get nothing back out of except for the experience. They have done a really good job in terms of engaging audiences. It's voluntary, doesn't pay, and in terms of player time, it's about 17 plus hours per week. That's a lot of time if we can capitalize. And I had the opportunity to go to the gaming conference that took place a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco. And you can download this game. This is from Level X. This is, if you want to see if you can be a cardiologist, this is a game on the App Store. It's also on the Android store. You can interact with a patient, go through a process to run a full-on fluoroscopy interaction, put stents in and so forth. They have one for using a bronchoscope. And this is the sort of new instance of gaming where we've got this capacity to interact with the screen in different ways. So it's going to change the way. I don't know if you remember when the iPhone first showed up and we had this scrolling, and I went to the supermarket and was looking at the receipt on the digital thing I was signing, and I was trying to scroll it, and of course it didn't work. But I'd already been acclimated to that experience. And we'll see new versions of this. This one on the left is a new sensor that's virtual, so we can twist the knob and it senses all of that using a very small sensor. That's the size of the sensor. And then over on the right, I experienced this. This is full visual field acuity interaction in a lens. And I was able to stand in Dubai airport traffic control and interact with all of the planes. I was looking at a glass. It was as real as anything I could possibly imagine. Clever use of technology to paint the picture where the actual eye is looking. We'll start to see that as part of the potential for new interactions across the telehealth experience if you start to have this virtualization of the world. Let's finish off with genomics and sequencing. This is the sort of statutory data point that we have. The precipitous drop when we had CRISPR sequencing, that's a logarithmic scale, and we were sort of at millions when we first sequenced that data. We're now sub $1,000. How many people in this audience have been genome sequenced in any fashion at all? Hands up. Yeah, not as many as I thought. So I've been fully, so there's 23andMe in the variants, and then there's full genome sequencing. I've had both of those. It starts to offer new insights, but what's interesting is it creates this enormous amount of data and also privacy issues. So if you've seen some of the output from those data points, we're seeing people finding or solving old crimes based on that data. The 14 million new cancer patients would generate 5.6 exabytes. I have not found a visual that I can represent how much data that is and how big that is in terms of size. It's just enormous, and the processing capacity for that is just astounding. So it's going to create some data problems, and certainly in terms of transfer of information. But that's just the start. This is the biome. So you have at least 20 plus other sequences that are relevant. Every organ system has some form of biome. That's at least a 3 to 10x multiplier in terms of that data. And we're able to sequence at the point of care now with USB plug-in sequences and even iPhone plug-in sequences that will sequence your DNA, not the full genome sequencing, but targeted. That offers new ways from a telehealth standpoint that you can test and innovate. And if you think about the biome, every organ has a microbiome. We've already seen disease that offers you this capability to impact the disease. To give you an example, in diabetics, we can see a different microbiome in the gut. That's the gut bacteria in diabetics versus people that do not have diabetes. So the obvious question is, if we change the biome, can we treat the diabetes and reverse it just by changing the gut bacteria? We haven't seen that in diabetes. We saw a study that was published last year in Australia that treated asthmatic children by changing their biome successfully. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as we start to associate these other subsystems in the body. Incremental point for all of you, if you haven't been sequenced and you're taking any medications, 99% of the population have an actionable variant. So something that is different in your your DNA sequence that impacts the way that you metabolize drugs that are commonly the top 20 drugs used to treat patients. My personal example, so I am a Plavix ultra rapid metabolizer. So Plavix, one of the commonest drugs used in cardiac therapy, not terribly useful for me, or at least if it is, you've got to change the dosage. I'm not very good with antidepressants, and I'm sensitive to warfarin if I was ever, I'm not on any of these drugs. So think about that. If you're ever going on to a drug, that's going to become part of, and if you want to think about it from your own personal standpoint, important. And for me, this was just kind of interesting. My odds of developing male pattern baldness were low. Well, that's good news. I'm glad to hear that. My brothers were most upset to hear this because it hasn't impacted them in the same way. Some interesting but unusual variants. I have better than average language capabilities, and I've got increased susceptibility to risk-taking behavior. I have jumped out of an airplane with a parachute at 12,500 feet many times. I have done certainly some risky things. I like to do those, so there's some truth in this. And apparently I'm likely to live slightly longer than average. I'm not saying that there's pure science behind that, but it certainly provides some interesting concepts. I want to close with a video to give you a sense of where this might go. It's just a short sort of insight using technology that we believe can impact the way that healthcare is delivered.
Hey sis, I need to talk to you about something.
What? Are you and the baby okay?
Something happened after our chat this morning. Which was great, by the way. I love seeing the kids connect. And you got to see my little footballer.
Sis, tell me what's up.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Remember our call was interrupted?
Yeah.
Well, it was my personal health advisor. And when she calls, I get anxious about the little one.
And?
When she contacted me, I freaked out thinking something was wrong. By monitoring my data, she can see I'd contracted some kind of infection. She walked me through my treatment plan, which now includes taking more fluids and extra vitamins. And she even customized my yoga routine too.
Oh my, what a scare.
Yeah, it was at first, but it's amazing and comforting to know that they can figure this stuff out without even seeing me.
What about the infection? How did they see that?
Well, thank heavens they keep an eye on all my data, and they caught the early signs of something. Back when I was expecting Theo, my doctor would never have guessed something was wrong. This could have easily turned into a disaster.
Is it really that bad?
Well, I've got a genome deviation or something like that, which combined with the pregnancy means I'm less receptive to normal treatments. It's quite rare, and they're able to cross-reference my info with millions of people around the world to find out what's best for me and the baby. Knowing they're on it helps me to relax, actually.
Wow.
She knows how much I dislike drugs, so she made me a personalised holistic plan, which includes diet suggestions, a vitamin regimen, and a special workout routine to minimise the amount of meds we need to take.
Well, even though she freaked you out, it must be good to know they're looking out for you.
Absolutely, and my meds are linked to my health service so they can monitor my recovery. And of course, it really helps getting highly personalised medication.
Well, I just hope you can keep up with Theo today.
That's it.
So a little insight into where things might go. Hopefully that gives you a sense of the excitement, the opportunity, and the potential for healthcare across this full continuum. I would tell you healthcare is in crisis. Technology, and in particular telehealth, is the central component. It is the glue that will change the trajectory. We cannot continue to deliver healthcare in the way that we've been doing so. Healthcare needs to be well care. That's the no fun to fun section. It absolutely has to change. We are not delivering the best possible options. We have to find these diseases ahead of time, and we can do so. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you see it, for every piece of information that we identify, we're going to find an additional 50 or more. That's really exciting. I think we're going to look back at medicine. I know what I already do. I'll give you one example of this. When I was in medical school, we looked at DNA. They were just about sequencing it. They'd sequenced the genome, and essentially the view was 95% of the genome was junk. And we just took that as acceptable, normal information. Clearly it's not. It all has contributions, we just didn't understand it. That whole genome and biome is absolutely going to revolutionize the way in which we interact with the healthcare system and the way in which this industry, and in particular the healthcare and the medical home, is going to deliver healthcare. And ultimately, I quote one of my old bosses, Michael Dell, who says, technology has always been about enabling human potential. It's not about replacing. I know people look at some of this technology and say, where's my job going? But if you look back at the techno-panic timeline, that's not what happened. We find different roles. And we want people and people engagement, and that's what you get in healthcare. We just need to enable more of that, and we need to augment it so that it's safer and better. And that's what all of this is going to hopefully do. Thank you very much.
For a few questions, so we'll have Jason flip to the question board. I already have a bunch up there. There's also mics on the in the aisleways.
Yes, I'll share my presentation slides. I will post them. I'm trying to think of the SlideShare. I will put them on SlideShare. I'll put a little post up, and I'll put it so that you can download.
We'll put it in the app once we have a copy.
And obviously I'll with you. I don't share them ahead of time because it tends to spoil the surprise a little bit, so my apologies for that. But
there's a monitor here if you.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'll answer number 2 first. That's years of practice has taught me that there's no point in getting angry. And I'll tell you a little bit of background. My wife has just started a new job, and that was the alert to tell me that she's going to be working. So I have to make sure I'm back home to look after the cat. So that's why that was important, and it showed up. But so let's see. How can technology help this? Yeah, so that's a great point. You know, a lot of this technology is advanced and highly significant. So that the Apple Watch, and I talk about some of those futures. And there's 2 responses to that I think are significant. One is the fact that the technology prices are coming down, but some of the things that I didn't talk about, and we've seen huge benefits from, simple text messaging. So cell phone use exceeds, or cell phone ownership exceeds ownership of toothbrushes. That's one of common quotes you might hear. And our capacity to use that, and those are not smartphones, so they can't do some of the things that I show. But simple text messaging, I gave you an example of the African midwives and the huge impact of saving 2 lives and the positive engagement with that community. But we've seen text messaging. The other interesting thing about text messaging, and think about this in your own world, when the phone rings, do you answer it? Mostly not. If my phone doesn't know who you are, I'm not answering it. If an email arrives, 60+% ends up in the spam folder that I used to look at, now I don't. And even if it's in my email, I don't look at it. I want to say it's as high as 80, it could be as high as 90% of people respond to text messages within 5 minutes. That engagement level is just incredibly useful. And you think about that, so there's new companies that are taking that principle and applying recipes or menus to deliver information and dribble it out across text messages. Instead of sending a patient home with guidance for their colonoscopy prep, they say, they're on the colonoscopy prep and they're coming in next week on Wednesday. So we backtrack, and then 72 hours we send them a text message, say, hey, get ready, make sure that you have your colonoscopy prep and you've got it. And then 48 hours, start lightening. And that provides this enormous positive benefit. That's not costly. So there are opportunities, but solving those problems of food deserts and this lack of resources is part of that no fun to fun, and that's where I see this not about just pure technology, but focusing on the wellness of care. Great question, and I'm 100% in agreement with that. Yeah, so I didn't talk about reimbursement. That's a fair point, but Data point that I would reference, if the VA can do it, the rest of the US can do it. The idea that this practice of medicine can't possibly, and I think this industry has done a tremendous job in advocating and changing. Kathy actually cited one of the changes in her opening statements this morning about this new change for accessibility. That is our responsibility. And the other thing that I think is going to help us change this is the silver tsunami of people. So that's the aging generation. I forget the statistic of how many people age into Medicare every day, but it's a large number. And they're all walking around using cell phones. They get FedEx instant updates. Things are delivered to their house instantly. And then they walk into their physician's office and they go, wait, what? You've got a paper form, and I've got... They're not going to put up with this, and they're not going to put up with this requirement to go in. And that silver tsunami, the consumerization, and I'm a little bit hesitant to use that. I don't think patients are necessarily consumers, but I think they consume healthcare in some fashion, are going to help drive that change and say, we're not putting up with this. It is that mass of folks that I think absolutely pack up, are going to help change that. This is a great way to do it, but I feel a little bit disconnected from the people asking the questions. So whoever asks
You're welcome to come to the mic if you have
please do.
dialogue.
I love this. This is great. Yeah, we've got that. Gene testing. What gene testing platform did you use for those detailed results? So there's multiples. So I started with 23andMe, which is a partial exome sequencing. Then I had a full Illumina genome sequence, and I captured the full data. Interesting story around that in terms of some of the disconnects. And I did it because I wanted to understand how it would impact people individually. So I went and I had my genome sequenced, and they produced a digital file. It was hundreds of mega. It's probably a gigabyte or more. And it had to, I went through my physician, although I could have ordered it myself, so that I could understand that process. And I wanted a copy. So what happened with that? They sent a printed report and a USB stick to my physician. My physician scanned the paper report, refused to plug in the USB stick because that was a security concern, and threw it away. And then I went to my physician and said, I'd like a copy, and they hit print on the scanned image and handed me my 50-page report of my content. I had to go another route to get that. So the systems in place don't work. You can then submit that. There are a number of services. Some are free, others are small amounts of money. I can't remember off the top of my head. And it will provide you ongoing evidence linked to the science of what those genome sequences mean. And to be clear, this is all statistical. So I have a lower risk of heart disease, surprisingly, given my father, and maybe a high, I don't know if this is true, but let's say a higher risk of Alzheimer's. That does not mean I will get Alzheimer's. It just means I'm going to play more Sudoku as I get older.
We have a question over at the mic.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I just mostly maybe have a comment more than a question. I'm impressed with all the automation and the artificial intelligence, and I, as a registered nurse, work in telehealth. But one of the challenges I see is how are we going to keep that interpersonal relationship with patients, which I see that could be
Yeah, so that's a great question. I spent a significant amount of my career. Back in the 90s, I developed one of the world's first paperless medical records. And I still feel like I'm apologizing for that because I was contributory to the electronic medical record that has tortured our clinicians for many years. And what we did was we automated the existing system and created something that instead of focusing on the patient, we focus on the screen, which is absolutely detracted from the humanity of healthcare. I'll take some ownership of that. I think I certainly contributed to that. We're now seeing some opportunity to turn that around with artificial intelligence and listening so that I can focus on the individual. If you've seen some of the demos, and to be clear, I used to work for them, I don't, but Nuon showed a demonstration of this, the virtual assistant listening in, produced the documentation, and all the engagement was this. So I think there's hope on the horizon. Again, remember, I'm a proton, so I think we can turn that around. It reminds me a lot of the car or the automation industry when they developed electrical engines. And what they did was they positioned it the same place that they would the steam engine that had to be remote and had pulleys. And of course, you didn't need to do that. We need to do the same thing with technology. So great question, absolutely. It's not 2 years away. I think it's real close, and you should look at some of those opportunities. Essential. Thank you.
Thank you for a very provocative discussion, very interesting. Could you elaborate a bit on the microbiome of organs? I understand that my gut has a microbiome. After all, stool is mostly bugs.
Yep.
But I assume my blood is sterile. I assume my brain is sterile, et cetera. Am I wrong?
No, so the blood, yes, but other organs, so your adrenal gland, your brain, all of those have, I don't want to say complicit, symbiotic bacterial relationships or other organism relationships that interact. So not everything, but there are at least 100 systems that have symbiotic relationships with other contributory. Even the mitochondria, which we just considered were the powerhouse of our cells, turns out there's much more complexity to that, and we're starting to see the ability to impact and save people that have life-threatening diseases or even terminal diseases by getting involved in the mitochondrial systems.
So I take it these organisms are not pathogenic?
No.
And if that's right, what is it about the immune system, if you know, that allows that to happen? Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm going to pass on trying to answer that question in front of this audience and potentially mislead you, except to say that the immune system is really smart, mostly. When it goes wrong, that's when we see some of the problems and we get autoimmune disorders and so forth. But mostly it understands the difference between self and non-self through signaling. But I'm really at a too high a level. It's a fascinating problem that we still don't fully understand, but it will be part of our future for sure to understand necessarily.
We had a actually upvoted question about EMRs. Can you scroll down just a little bit? There you go. With clinicians experiencing burnout from EMRs, how do we get them to adopt even more technology?
Yeah, so burnout, absolutely an imperative problem. I would tell you in hindsight, I think I definitely burnt out. I worked a 1 in 2. That's 136-hour a week activity. And, you know, yes, we are, the EMR is contributory, and, you know, we've done ourselves a disservice by introducing technology that didn't satisfy the clinicians. And the necessity for the technologists is to involve people that can help that. So it's not just about individuals like me, but it's all of you that contribute. So the team-based approach that says, what is the problem that we're solving, and how do we make lives easier versus, wow, this is really cool technology, we must apply it, I think is the essential element to that. But that's absolutely right. We've done ourselves a disservice and made it harder to introduce, rightly so, because we did such a poor job with some of these things.
Thank you for a great presentation, Dr. Nick.
Thank you.
Our healthcare system is kind of closed right now as one patient, one clinician. I like what you say. What do you predict how long it will take us to be in a stage where I can share my health information in a gamification way without consequences of insurance companies hovering over me, but then the clinician sphere can, using gamification, give me predictive analysis and saying, hey, if you do X, Y, Z, this is how you're going to be.
Yeah, so the proton in me says within the next couple of years. The realist in me says it's probably a little bit longer than that. The one piece of technology I didn't talk about, and you know, I'm almost hesitant to because it's been a little bit overhyped. It's in the sort of, you know, peak of over-expected, inflated expectations, whatever the Gartner system is blockchain. And there's a really interesting company called Humanity. It's human-t.co, the hashtag my31. And their principle is to essentially put your data, my 31 is your 31st right, and it is your right to own and control your own data and offer the capacity for people to use it. And I think we're going to see more of that. Our ability to control data and at a granular level, blockchain offers some capabilities around that. And to say, I'm going to authorize people to use this in this fashion, and at some point I'll withdraw rights and access. What's interesting about that is 100% almost of people, when they're really sick or suffering a terminal disease like cancer and struggling with health, are willing to share all of their data. No holds barred, because they're now desperate. It's that intervening point in time where we want to contribute, but we don't want to. I'll give you my data, but don't use it against me, is my simplest version of that. My 31, I think, is one of the pathways. It's not perfect, but it's an incremental step. Don't let perfection stand in the way of progress. Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Nick, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. My name is Quintus Brown. I'm with Versa Integrated Solutions out of Maryland, so I'll follow up when we're back home. But my question today is, well, actually yesterday, Rebecca Gwilt talked about the complexity in the regulatory landscape between the different regulatory bodies that have to interact and how federal and state entities need to interact. What do you see as kind of the biggest challenges that regulatory agencies need to recognize, or laws that need to be passed to enable their future vision?
Yeah, so there's a constant push-pull, and I'd like to have covered the regulatory in more detail, but I feel less qualified than many of the folks that are up on this stage to talk about it. But let me say this. The push-pull is that on the one hand, the regulators don't want you to be exposed to inappropriate use of individuals, technology. We want to protect the consumer. That's the overriding purpose. Let's suppose good. I see most people trying to do good. I think the very, very small proportion we shouldn't devolve down to assess. The corresponding challenge is, does a physician in California learn different medicine to one in Virginia? I would suggest not. I mean, I don't feel like those are different activities. How do we reconcile that? A good friend of mine I interviewed just recently gave me the overriding methodology to bring people together, and I'm going to share it. I'll give him credit. It's Dr. Atul Boot. He's a professor at UCSF, and he talks about the use of data. And he said, bring those parties together with the same economic incentives. And ultimately, I think that issue of conflict between California and Virginia is about money. And let's be frank, it's a central part of our system. We can't sort of ignore it. And you have to align those incentives so that everybody is getting a fair shake and their views and opinions, and they reconcile all of the investment that they've made in getting credentialed, the regulatory infrastructure. So that's the only way. Well, it's not the only way. I think it's the best path forward to bring consensus to folks to find a pathway forward so that we can, stop this, limitation of practice that doesn't make any scientific sense.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. I have to read this one question, though. If the car weighs me and notices I'm gaining weight, does the car kick me out and make me walk?
It should,
Great
right?
question.
Oh, yes, they're April Fools. Did anybody spot? I was going to ask that, but we got to this very quickly. This was fantastic. Anybody have a guess? No? Actually available? Great guess. I can't. That might be true. I use soccer as my game, so I don't know too much about March Madness. But that wasn't the one I picked. Anybody else? That's it. Well done. Congratulations. It was the drone taking the dog for the walk. Not. Although I can see that happening, but that defeats the point, right? In my view. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.